The Brexit conspiracy. You need to hear. We weren't supposed to leave the EU. You probably know that one already. But when you look at the detail of how the government has reacted to Brexit, you can unearth some very interesting conspiracies, perhaps even truths. The Brexit Collection by Chicken Wire. Do you want a shirt that's topical, neutral, and cheap? Do you want to support this channel? Well, now you can with my Brexit collection of shirts. Each shirt is fairly neutral and contains a slogan or a thumbnail about Brexit. So check out the link in the description if you want to support this channel.
One of the things that comes out of that period that you've described in the book, and the book itself, unmistakably and unavoidably, is dishonesty. And there are 3 examples where the regime, the government, was dishonest, I would say, and I'd like to put them to you, and they come directly from your book. The first one is when Cameron said again and again and again that under different circumstances he might lead a Leave Europe campaign. He might be in charge of the Leave campaign, get us out. Reading your book, that is completely inconceivable. And in fact, even before the negotiations had started, you and he were organising what was going to become the Remain campaign.
I don't think it was inconceivable. I think there were points during the previous to the renegotiation where David Cameron was incredibly frustrated with Europe. The big question for David Cameron was, is this an organisation that's capable of change? Now, that only emerged over time, and he was only able to see that over time. And also, I think what you've got to remember about this period as well is during that period, business leaders, economists were coming out with more and more reports saying they were concerned about this. So actually, you can't see it as just a simple, I'm here now and now I'm there. It was across a spectrum over time.
We are approaching one of the biggest decisions this country will face in our lifetimes, whether to remain in a reformed European Union or to leave. The choice goes to the heart of the kind of country we want to be and the future that we want for our children.
So we all know that David Cameron offered the EU referendum as a way of uniting his party and ending Euroscepticism once and for all. It was a really dumb move because he already knew by the results of the 2015 election.
Don't you accept that all of you have actually messed up on Scotland, every party, and you've allowed Nicola Sturgeon, who is a very impressive campaigner, to rule the roost? None of you has gone to Scotland and said, we hear you, we bleed for you, we understand what we've done to you in the past. We know you're alienated from Parliament, we'll make it work.
Well, actually, we did all work together, those of us who believe in the United Kingdom, in the referendum campaign. There was a clear result from the Scottish people.
But the tsunami
I don't think it's
continued.
a case of allowing the Scottish National Party to do anything. It will be up to the voters in Scotland what they decide tomorrow. But it will be a terrible mess in the House of Commons if a majority is dependent on the Scottish National Party, because their inclination will be to set Scotland against England, England against Scotland, to try and win the Scottish elections next year.
You haven't got a tilt in Westminster.
Well, we will see. On this, I agree with Chuck. The people haven't voted yet, so that may be something. I hope that isn't something you can say in the future. We're doing well in parts of Scotland.
William's got a cheat talking about setting up different nations against each other. I think one of the most damaging things in respect for Scotland that the Prime Minister did was the day after the referendum, seemingly to go back on his word on that vow. That was obviously incredibly. He sought to do that, and that was completely dishonourable. And ultimately, what we should all be seeking to do, you're right, I think it's the right challenge, is to be winning back support in all parts of the country. That's what we've sought to do, but I think you've seen a very different approach on the part of the Conservatives.
We haven't heard it from Labour, not in the big way. Look, all of you have been talking about don't touch the SNP.
Yeah, for good reason, because of the warning I have just given.
You've got to touch the Scots.
I make no apology. I disagree with Trigger.
You've got to touch the Scots.
The point is, John, our job is not to make the case for the SNP. It's to make the case for our own parties and our policies.
No, but you cannot simply write off. I mean, if you get 35, 40, 50 seats, if the SNP get that, you can't just say, no deal, we're not going to do anything with them. They're filthy Scots.
Well, I don't think anybody has said that, and I think I speak for everybody here. Nobody's talked about them being
filthy,
filthy,
that's the impression you give.
Scots. Well, no, I don't think it is.
Adamant it's been brutal.
Look, the way our democracy works is that we all seek a majority government. That's how this first-past-the-post system works. Whether we like it or not, that is how it works. And we put forward our offer, and I invite people to support it.
Just because a side loses a referendum, the SNP, then that doesn't mean they go away. They gain seats in that election. But nonetheless, he went ahead with an EU referendum. but also had already pre-announced his future resignation at the end of his term.
Would you go for a third term?
No, I think, I'm standing for a full second term. I'm not saying all Prime Ministers necessarily definitely go mad, or even go mad at the same rate. But I think, I feel I've got more to bring to this job. I think the job is half done. The economy's turned around, the deficit's half down. I want to finish the job.
And he kicked off what could be 5 years of speculation about who might take the job on from him.
There definitely comes a time where a fresh pair of eyes and fresh leadership would be good. And the Conservative Party has got some great people coming up, the Theresa Mays and the George Osbornes and the Boris Johnsons and there's plenty of talent there. I'm surrounded by very good people.
The full 5 years, but no third term.
The third term is not something I'm contemplating.
Another example of which I think a more direct one perhaps is that David Cameron came onto this programme and sat on the sofa, and I asked him directly, if you lose, will you stay on as Prime Minister? And he looked me in the eye and he looked at the TV camera and he said, yes, definitely. And you were reinforcing that message too, and that was always nonsense, wasn't it?
Well, you were asking him to speculate about his future, and what
Absolutely.
he did was he answered the question at the time. Now, the reality is you can only judge circumstances as they actually happen. And when you approach those circumstances and you come to that moment, he took the decision that actually it wouldn't be the right thing for him to do. But I think to hold him to account for something that he said just a few weeks before, when actually the reality of the situation was impacting on him, was very different.
It was then that old rival and friend Boris Johnson decided to be on the Leave side. Boris was a better speechmaker and a more likeable politician at the time. His decision to run for the Leave campaign was a huge blow to Cameron and Remain.
OK, a third example seemed to me when Boris Johnson suddenly announced that he was going to be involved in the Leave campaign. We were all told by Downing Street that he had only 9 minutes or previously, I think, sent a text to the Prime Minister telling him what he was going to do. And to many of us, that seemed really bad behaviour and coloured our view of Boris Johnson for a long time afterwards. It turns out from your book that wasn't the case, that he'd been sending texts and emails to the Prime Minister about his agonising choice for some time beforehand.
Well, let me describe in detail exactly what happened with Boris, just to clear that up. When we came back from the renegotiation on the morning, we were discussing what David Cameron was going to say in the Cabinet, and there was a ping on his BlackBerry, and he stopped for a moment, he put his elbows on his knees, his glasses were on the edge of his nose, and he looked at his BlackBerry, and he spent some time reading the message, and he looked up and said, "It's out." And we all knew at that moment he was talking about Boris. And then he went through what was a very well-argued, very human message saying how Boris had reached that conclusion.
I've been agonising about it.
Exactly. 4 hours later, I received a phone call from David Cameron saying, you haven't said anything about Boris saying he's out, have you? And I hadn't, because I didn't think it was appropriate to reveal that at that time. But what David Cameron was saying was Boris was at that point saying he could be reconsidering, and he wasn't so sure. So actually, we were in a period of not knowing which way Boris was actually going to go until 9 minutes before. The final confirmation came 9 minutes before. We could have revealed the extent to which Boris was wobbling all over the place like a wonky shopping trolley, as he described it himself, but we chose not to. And I think that actually was an honourable thing to do, not questionable, as you put it.
Except that it made it look as if he had kept the Prime Minister in the dark all the way through until the last minute, and then dropped him in it.
But let me ask you, which would have been better, that we'd revealed at that point that he was sending texts to the Prime Minister, that he was that he was all over the place? I don't think Boris would have thanked us for that.
The mainstream media tried to reporting the facts of the economic difficulties leaving the EU might create, but the coverage of the campaign became pretty one-sided for Remain.
We are somewhere in the English countryside on the trail of the biggest beast of them all, the Vote Leave bus. I was going to say lesser spotted, but perhaps much spotted might be slightly more appropriate. The number on the side of it seems to change on a more or less weekly basis. First it was 350 million, then it was 50 million, and now it's back to being 350 million again. Their point, though, is straightforward. This is your money, and all of it is going to Brussels. In fact, the real number is less than half that. After you take off the rebate, which never leaves the country, by the way, the 350 million comes down to £277 million a week. Then there's all the money the EU spends here on farms, on investment projects. That takes it down to 190 million, or even 110 million, depending on whose figures you consult. Of all of the porcupines told during this campaign, this one, £350 million, has got to be the worst. And worse still, the Leave camp carry on using it regardless of the fact that everyone has essentially corrected it. It's almost as if they think any publicity is good publicity.
Trying to lecture the public on the economic impacts of migration without considering the human costs. Meaning Farage could turn against the entire establishment, branding it all as one.
That audience was ridiculously to the left. But you know what? I don't think it really matters. What matters are the millions of people at home that were watching it. Yes, I felt very isolated. I was there with four political leaders who couldn't even understand the basic fact that if the population rises by millions, it puts pressure on housing. I have to say, I'm very happy to be isolated if they can't see through that.
Leave also won, partly due to Cameron already being the Prime Minister and Boris and UKIP not. David was a spent force in the public's minds, imposing austerity, winning an election, then announcing he would resign in 5 years, meaning despite all the issues of Brexit, we had a Prime Minister who didn't seem to care.
It's why we delivered a fair, legal and decisive referendum in Scotland. And it's why I made the pledge to renegotiate Britain's position in the European Union and to hold a referendum on our membership, and have carried those things out. And I made clear the referendum was about this and this alone, not the future of any single politician, including myself. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
The response to the vote proved there were plenty out to stop us leaving. David Cameron resigned in an attempt to salvage the reputation of his party. Michael Gove ran for leadership and in doing so stabbed Boris Johnson in the back.
OK, let's turn to the guy who is the villain of your book, Michael Gove. You're very, very hard on Michael Gove. You call him a destructive game player whose behaviour was shameful. He suffers from poison, he spread poison. He suffers from a vaulting ambition and a preparedness to mislead. Isn't the truth about Michael Gove that actually he realised what the British people thought? He could see very clearly he had a principled position against the EU right from the beginning, which the rest of you didn't have, and that he was right and you were all wrong?
Well, look, I think we did have principled positions for a start. I'm not questioning the fact that Michael Gove is a Eurosceptic. That's absolutely right, and it's a perfectly legitimate position. I respect that. But let's look at some of the things that happened and why I describe him that way. 2 days before he announced that he was going to be chair of the Leave campaign, he told the Prime Minister he wouldn't play a leading role in that. When he was leading that campaign, that was setting itself up almost as an alternative government. It was questioning policies that were only tangentially related to Europe, the NHS, the national living wage.
You saw a coup coming, in short.
He questioned the integrity of the Prime Minister, saying that he was corroding public trust. Now, that was concerning to us and was not behaviour that we necessarily expected from him.
That having consulted colleagues, and in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me. My role will be to give every possible support to the next Conservative administration to make sure that we properly fulfil the mandate of the people that was delivered at the referendum and to champion the agenda I believe in. To stick up for the forgotten people of this country.
Boris knew he now had no chance, so stepped out of the leadership battle. It was Andrea Leadsom and Theresa May in the final stages of the leadership battle, one Remainer and one Leaver. However, because Leadsom said some stupid things...
Genuinely, I feel being a mum means you have a very real stake in the future of our country, a tangible stake. You know, I mean, she possibly has nieces, nephews, you know, lots of people, but I have children.
And Theresa kept reserved. Theresa won that battle.
Let's ask about Theresa May in your book, because she appears on the edges of the story again and again and again. You describe her as a submarine under the waters. You're never quite sure which way she's going to jump. Somebody at one point says, we're not even sure if she's working for the other side, if she's a double agent.
That
and
was
so
Will
forth.
Straw.
That's Will Straw.
One,
but you're pretty negative about her all the way through. Isn't the truth that actually, again, she saw it better than you guys did, that she wanted to put out a statement saying that she didn't want to insult people's intelligence, she said, by claiming that everything about the EU is perfect, that membership of the EU is wholly good, or that the sky will fall in if we vote to leave. And you wouldn't let her say that.
No, what I was perfectly happy for Theresa May to do was to express her opinions and say what was right, and she was sincere in those, and that's acceptable. What I'm simply describing in the book is what was it like to be in the middle of this tumultuous campaign. Now, it was very difficult in the lead-up to that campaign, having a Home Secretary not reveal which side she was on. When she did reveal what side she was on, it was 51-49, and was very equivocal, and that was difficult. It's perfect. I think we're agreeing with each other, Andrew.
Okay.
It's perfectly legitimate for Theresa May to do that. What the book is doing is recounting what was it like being in Downing Street to be part of this tumultuous situation.
But then you have to ask, was this her plan all along? To not say anything about Brexit, knowing the referendum itself to be a bad decision? To keep quiet in a fraught leadership battle? To have proof of experience and support of the Cameron establishment on her side? To use the Murdoch media to push Leadsom out of the race and ultimately buy her way into the top job. Not because she wanted the top job, but because the Remainers, those who didn't want Brexit to happen, the establishment, needed someone to subvert it. Now, Theresa had the job of seeming as though she was going to get a Brexit deal in order to support the will of the people. She wanted to do everything herself.
During the Conservative Party leadership campaign, I was described by one of my colleagues as a bloody difficult woman. And I said at the time, the next person to find that out will be Jean-Claude Juncker.
But other Remainers, such as Gina Miller, made sure she had to ask Parliament to trigger Article 50.
Today, 8 of the 11 Supreme Judges upheld the judgment handed down by the High Court in November in a case that went to the very heart of our Constitution and how we are governed. Only Parliament can grant rights to the British people, and only Parliament can take them away. No Prime Minister, no government can expect to be unanswerable or unchallenged.
Which also empowered Parliament to ask for more and more votes on the topic. She appointed old Cameron rival Boris to government as Foreign Secretary. It was their way of giving him the platform to make insensitive, racist remarks he's renowned for, and thus keeping your enemies closer. She then called a general election.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June.
But weirdly, didn't take part in any of the TV debates. Was this her way of handing the complexities of Brexit to Labour, or was she just really that incompetent? Either way, her winning a small minority government made things harder, not easier.
I mean, it was a dreadful campaign. You don't have actually, lots of parts of the manifesto are actually extremely good. But if you're going to look at social care, you have to put that policy, if you even have to start to detail a policy, in a way that actually explains that this is a good thing that you are going to do. When you talk about the changes you're going to make in school lunches, you start with the headline that says children from poorer families will now get 2 free meals a day. You don't start from the basis that some children will lose a free school meal. So all the way along it, those sorts of messaging were appalling. And then, of course, the change of heart on social care, I'm afraid, deeply flawed Theresa May. It did not make her look the strong and stable Prime Minister and leader that she had said that she was. That was a very difficult and very serious blow, I think, in terms of her own credibility and the way that the campaign was being run, which was about her and what she wanted to do, and she put her mark absolutely on this campaign.
The election itself was a small victory for Remain, making it even harder for May to get Brexit passed in Parliament.
2 years to get to this point. Have you finally reached a deal that keeps everyone in your cabinet on side and your Brexiteers at the cabinet table?
Well, in detailed discussions today, the Cabinet has agreed our collective position on the future of our negotiations with the EU. And our proposal will create a UK-EU free trade area, which establishes a common rulebook on industrial goods and agricultural products. This will maintain high standards, but we will ensure that no changes can take place without the approval of our Parliament. As a result, we will avoid friction in trade. That will protect jobs and livelihoods and also meet our commitment to Northern Ireland. We've also agreed a new business-friendly customs model with freedom to strike trade deals around the world. And now we want to get on at pace, negotiating this with the EU to bring prosperity and security to people.
But when May delivered Chequers, she was attempting to sell it as a form of Brexit, but reassure Remainers along the way. A best of both worlds. But it was a disaster. Even the EU disliked it.
In plain English, this would mean we'd still have to abide by all the EU rules. Uncontrolled immigration from the EU would continue, and we couldn't do trade deals we want with other countries. That would make a mockery of the referendum we had 2 years ago.
The EU has the upper hand because they can use Northern Ireland as the bargaining chip of the Brexit deal. Keep saying no to any special arrangement the government comes up with regarding it, keep frightening the UK with memories of the Troubles, and they can then persuade the UK to stay in the customs union and thus get us to pay for its access. May is only allowing two options, her deal or no deal. Why? Because that helps her get something passed in Parliament. If you frighten ministers with a doomsday scenario of what might happen to food, to trade, to Northern Ireland in the event of a no deal, you can get them to support the only deal. But Parliament has other plans. Labour wants to be in the customs union, the SNP want to be in both the customs union and single market, the Tories are split, the Leavers want a Canada Plus style deal, and some in Parliament want either a general election or a second referendum. If Chequers gets rejected, Parliament would be forced to either support a no deal or decide what to do next. Oust May perhaps, ask for an extension on Article 50 perhaps. The electorate will know if we're not getting a good deal, and that will likely obliterate the Tories forever.
According to a report by Reuters on Wednesday, European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said that a Brexit deal with Britain remains far away.
1 minute we're told the deal is dead, the next the EU is saying a deal is coming very, very soon.
I think that if we are realistic, we are able to reach an agreement on the first stage of this negotiation, which is the Brexit treaty, within 6 or 8 weeks.
Because there are lies being told, and we, the people, can sense it. But what's really happening behind the scenes is what's been happening all along. Timing's being delayed, whether deliberately or not. The media profits from drumming up fear. The politicians profit from stabbing each other in the back. And the truth, the neutral reality of Brexit, gets distorted. When time is delayed, it pushes us closer to a no deal and a possible snap election as a result. It hands power to Labour, who might offer a second referendum with an option to remain, or keep us in the customs union with a deal. Perhaps it's a deliberate last attempt to keep us in the EU, or maybe the government is just too incompetent to take us out. But regardless of what happens, it will be the electorate who suffers the most. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.